The Classic Comics Forum podcast presents issue number 8, Captain America by Steve Englehart, Part 1. Welcome back to the Classic Comics Forum podcast. I'm your host, Scott Harris, and in today's episode, I'm joined by the Classic Comics Forum's resident Captain America expert, The Captain, to discuss what is widely considered to be the most important and influential Captain America run of all time, issues number 153 to 186 by writer Steve Englehart. In the summer of 1972, new Marvel writer Steve Englehart was tasked by editor-in-chief Roy Thomas with reviving the increasingly out-of-touch and unpopular series Captain America. Within just a few short issues, Englehart had turned Captain America into one of Marvel's top-selling books, and he went on to craft a run that reinterpreted Captain America for a new generation and permanently redefined what it meant to be Captain America. And ironically, he brought Captain America into modern times by returning the character to its original roots as an overtly political character. In this first part of our two-part discussion of Steve Englehart's run on Captain America, the Captain and I discuss issues 153 through 168, where Englehart cleared up the mess left by previous creators and began laying the groundwork for what would become the most infamous and important Captain America storyline of all time. But first, as always, the Captain and I discuss his experiences in history as a comic book fan and collector. So we're going to jump right into that conversation, and I hope you enjoy. So, as always, my first question is, what was the first comic book you ever read?
First comic book I ever read would have been probably Star Wars #1. From Marvel. My grandmother from Memphis came and visited us every summer. She bought me the black polybagged 3-pack reprint of issues 1 through 3. Usually brought me a little something, so I was probably 5 or 6 years old when I got that. So that would have been probably the first 3 comics I read were those 3.
Well, that sounds like a pretty good place to start.
Yeah. In the late 70s, I had a lot of Marvel licensed properties. So people would give me the Star Wars books, the Godzilla books, Shogun Warriors, Micronauts, but none of the superhero stuff at that point. So that was really my introduction to the Marvel universe, as it were the licensed properties that they had.
So other than the comics we read to prepare for this podcast, what was the last comic you read?
Probably the last comic I read would have been, the new things I bought last week. So Aquaman and the last part of the most recent Serenity miniseries, Captain America, Sam Wilson 21. So just some newer stuff from last week.
Still sticking with the new stuff. Wow, you're a rare bird these days.
Well, oddly, my whole list has fallen. I think I have 6-7 books that I get on a regular basis now, and a couple of them are sort of habit buys. Right now, both the Captain America books are habit buys rather than actual interest buys, but there's some things that come out now and then that I'm interested in that I pick up. But I went from a high of probably 50 books a month down, like I said, probably about 6 or 7 at this point.
So who's a character that you love?
The easiest answer is Captain America. So that's been one of the ones that, over my whole time of collecting comics, I've really been drawn to. I'm not really sure when that started. Probably not until the Wade Garney run for the end of the original, so probably in the 430 to 455 range. But I've gone back and picked up actually all the issues of the series. But Captain America has just been one that I've always been drawn to.
And what character do you hate?
I probably have an irrational hatred for Wolverine. My first college roommate was literally obsessed with Wolverine. Posters and comic books and everything, and just even sort of adopted Wolverine's attitude. as he went about his regular life, and I just got so burned out on that character, particularly because I was a huge X-Men fan at the time, and it basically at one point just turned into Wolverine and the rest of the guys with the X gene, and I just got completely fed up with it.
That sounds like a completely rational hatred for Wolverine. I'm not a fan either. I didn't have the crazy roommate, but I think we've all seen that guy. There's nothing worse than when a character's popularity starts driving storylines.
Oh, absolutely, and you see it. I mean, my dislike for Wolverine has faded in time. I stopped reading the X books by and large. Now I'm pretty focused on disliking the what I call the gimmick characters, your Deadpools, your Harley Quinns, Gwenpool, just all of that sort of characters. I don't understand the popularity of it all. They just why people like them escapes me, but they seem to be everywhere constantly.
So, who is a creator that you think is underrated?
That's a great question, and I thought about this coming into this, and I'm not really. I don't necessarily know if I have a really good answer for that. I know like guys like Jerry Conway sometimes get a bad rap, but I liked his work on Amazing Spider-Man, and other guys who maybe don't get as much credit. I always liked Ron Friend. Always liked his stuff, and just didn't think that he ever got maybe, I don't want to say acclaim, but maybe the recognition that he should have. So probably those two.
Who's a creator do you think is overrated?
Well, I know most everybody else has answered Grant Morrison, so I really don't want to go that direction with again. Even though I love his work, I do think at times that Warren Ellis is overrated. He seems to write the same stories no matter what book he's on, and primarily like when he was working on Astonishing X-Men, he wasn't really writing X-Men stories. He was kind of writing his usual science-y stories and shoving the X-Men characters into that. Another one who, similar name, but Garth Ennis. I like Garth Ennis, but when you've read one of his books, you've pretty much read all of them. It's going to be hyper-violent. It's going to have a lot of swearing. It's going to be just kind of over the top, in your face, sort of like a Quentin Tarantino movie. And it's good, but I don't necessarily think it's always as great as people make it out to be.
I agree. There's a whole wave of British creators about that same time period that I am not a huge fan of. And for the most part, I think some of them are good, but I think they're pretty much all overrated. And that includes Morrison and Ellis and Ennis, and particularly Mark Millar.
Mm.
So to me, they're all kind of the same, cut from the same cloth, this cynical, kind of snarky, some variation of, taking the piss out of the superhero genre. And a little bit of that goes a long way for me. So I think Ennis is a very good writer, but like you said, once you've read one of his books, you've pretty much read all of it. He doesn't really try anything new. Speaking of trying anything new, if you had one title to take on a desert island with you, what series or story or title would you bring?
I would take Fables, particularly the first 75 issues of it, which are a complete story, and I've read that probably 4 or 5 times through. I usually do it about once a year. The art is so detailed, and the story is just so rich, and the characters. He takes the classic storybook characters and does something new with them. And I think every time I read it, I find something different that I hadn't seen before or hadn't thought of before as I've gone through it. The second half of the series, after issue 75, it's still good. It's not great. Sometimes I reread it when I'm going through. Other times I don't. My most recent attempt to get through that, I think I got up to about issue 120, and I was like, you know what? I don't feel like finishing it right now. I just kind of tucked it away back on the bookcase and it's been there for probably 3 months, so I haven't gone back and finished the last 30 issues. So that would be my pick.
That's an interesting pick. I mean, for me, I loved the first 75 issues of Fables, like you say. I thought it went spectacularly off the rails almost immediately in the crossover with Jack of Fables, and I forget what the Literals was it.
It was, and I've collected that in trades. That's the one trade that I don't have, and I've heard it's just so bad, and it doesn't really tie into anything else that you can really skip it, and you don't miss anything from the story before or the story after. So I'll be honest, I've never read that, but I've heard really bad things about it, which you're actually confirming.
It's terrible. It's like, it's hard to describe how bad it is, especially compared to how good everything had been up to that point. Yes, skipping it is highly recommended. But for me, it really put a sour taste in my mouth for the rest of the series. Because, like you said, the stuff after the first 75 issues, some of it's good, but it never really, to me, it seemed like the story was over with 75, and so it's kind of just a little episodic, no real direction for the rest of the series to me. I kept reading up to around 120, but then I just sort of dumped everything after issue 75 and just kept the first 75 issues.
Yeah, and that's I think the curse of something that's popular, when they just don't know when to stop. My wife and I right now are watching Friends from the beginning, and you can see that point in the series where it's like it was really good, great, and then there's that couple episode arc where you just see, okay, this show's lost its way completely. Or a TV show like Supernatural, they should have ended that after season 5. They'd told a complete story, they'd wrapped it up nicely, and now we're on season 12, and I've completely lost interest in it because it's just meandering now for the sake of, hey, people are still watching this, let's keep making it. So, yeah, I think definitely going back to someone we were just talking about, Garth Ennis, he had a vision for Preacher, and he said, this is how many issues I'm doing, and this is the story I'm telling. Boom. He ended it, and that was it. He didn't try to milk it beyond that. He told his story and quit, so I gave him a lot of respect for that.
Final question. If you could create any one dream book, any character, any company, any title, and any creators, doesn't matter whether they're alive or dead, what series would you want to see?
Just sticking with my favorite characters, since thinking about Captain America, I really would have loved to have seen what Kirby could have done outside of the 1960s Marvel method of Stan sends them a few lines, Jack draws it, and then Stan fills in the dialogue. I really would have liked to have seen Jack just be able to work with someone who kind of gave him more of a vision, and then he wasn't trying to create everything on his own, and then having somebody fill in words afterwards. So, I wouldn't mind seeing, kind of a segue here. I loved what Englehart did with that. So maybe teaming an Englehart up with a Kirby, or Englehart even up with, John Romita, whose artwork on the book, I think, probably rivals Kirby's, at least in my opinion. So maybe combining those kind of guys, or if you're going to take a more modern approach, say a Brubaker, and teaming him up with a Romita or a Kirby on that book.
I'm a big fan of Brubaker, and I'm a big fan of Brubaker's Captain America, which I guess not everybody on the classic forums is. I would love to see him work with someone like Kirby, though. I think that would have been fantastic. But yes, that was a perfect segue into today's topic, and that is Captain America number 153 to 186, the Steve Englehart era of Captain America. Now, in interviews, Steve Englehart has basically explained that he was brand new to Marvel, had only done a couple things at that time, and Roy came to him and gave him Captain America because Captain America was kind of floundering. It had been passed around to a few different writers. None of them really had a clear direction, and there wasn't really any reason, as Englehart says, for the book to even still exist at this point, because it's early 70s. And with the political situation in Vietnam, patriotic hero is just not as popular as it used to be, and the writers could not figure out a way to make him relevant and interesting to the viewers of the day. So Captain America was basically on the chopping block. They handed it over to Englehart, and according to both Englehart and Roy Thomas, when Englehart took over, he wasn't that familiar yet with Marvel continuity, so to get him started, Roy Thomas suggested, why don't you answer the question of who the Captain America of the 1950s was? Now, this is a question that fans have been having for a little while, because when Stan brought Cap back in Avengers number 4, he said that he had been frozen in an iceberg since the end of World War II. However, Marvel as Atlas had published 3 issues of a Captain America series in the 1950s, leading a lot of fans to wonder how those issues fit into continuity. So that was the question that Steve Englehart was given when he first took over the book with issue 153. And the result was a 4-issue storyline that immediately established Englehart as a force to be reckoned with and became an instant classic series. What did you think of that first arc, the Cap of the 1950s?
I really liked it, and I enjoyed how Englehart came in, and at the beginning of 153, he really did what he could to wrap up some storylines that were kind of hanging out there. The whole Nick Fury Countess Steve love triangle, which again, it just that really wasn't something that the book needed, and it was just kind of there as some space filler. And he has Sharon quit Shield so that they can go be together, and then they take off. And here's Sam left on his own for the first time to kind of be the hero in New York City, and then he gets attacked. And you're wondering, okay, who's attacking? Why is Captain Bucky attacking Sam? And that whole storyline, it's great because he knows it's not Cap, but he's going to get to the bottom of who is this guy who's coming at him and is so angry and racist, as much as racist as they can be at that time. They were still at a point where they couldn't really use harsh language, so but still calling them colored and boy, and they really drove home the fact that these guys were not the original and that their whole mindset was warped. I just loved how he kind of developed that and why they were that way, because of the chemicals that they ingested. So, that first storyline, he really comes in and immediately improves, like what you said, was just a completely floundering book that I've read the issues that led up to it once, I think, and it's nothing I'm ever going to revisit, most likely.
Yeah, the issues before this are completely forgettable. They have some cool covers. I'll give them that. There's some cool covers, but if anyone remembers them, it's mainly because there was a weird Kingpin storyline in it that involved Kingpin's wife, and that story's kind of become important retroactively. But for the most part, those issues didn't make any sense. There's a whole long-running subplot that we're going to talk about here because it eventually becomes important in Englehart's run, where Cap had, in his secret identity as Steve Rogers, become a member of the New York City police force, and that just a bizarre decision that never really worked in the book at all. But when Englehart took over, a couple things he did right off. I love the contrast. He immediately injects some not so subtle political commentary into the book with the contrast of the 1950s values of the characters versus the modern 1970s values. But he also, 154 is one of my favorite issues of his run because Captain America and Sharon have gone off to wherever they are, Bahamas or whatever, and they're frolicking on the beach, and we see all of 2 pages of them in the entire book. The whole issue is Falcon's solo book, and this is the first time where, on the masthead it says Captain America and the Falcon, and up to that point, he was basically just a sidekick. But this is the first time where you really feel like he's a partner and he's just as important as Captain America is in the series. And I really like that issue a lot.
Yeah, and it's funny that issue where you see Sam on his own and he's just as capable as Steve was. That comes into play later on when Steve comes back and he gets the super strength. Because you start to see some friction there between the two of them. So I think that Englehart did a really nice job here. It's like, okay, Sam has been, to your point, the sidekick in this book, and now let's give him a moment to shine because I'm setting something up down the road, which I think was a great hallmark of his run, is that there was always something else building towards down the road. If not next issue, 5 issues, you're going to see the payoff of this.
Now, at the end of this story, we discover in a very Roy Thomas sequence where he manages to fit in actual pages from some of the Captain America comics from the 50s. We discover that these were people who were idolized Captain America and Bucky, and they had their voices and features surgically altered, and then they had their own version of the super soldier serum that they took, only they got it wrong, and it made them eventually go crazy. And they've been in deep freeze ever since the 50s, ever since the government realized they were nuts. One twist here that I thought was kind of funny, particularly in retrospect, knowing what Englehart's going to do later, is that they're let out by a right-winger who's complaining that Nixon is being too soft, which I thought was like, Nixon wasn't extreme enough for this guy, so he decided to let the crazy Captain America out. Just knowing what we know about the Secret Empire story coming up much later, I found that to be kind of funny. But also, again, right off the bat, Englehart's injecting some political commentary into the series.
Yeah, and it made sense. I mean, you had a character in Captain America who was, facing Captain America 1. He's punching Hitler in the jaw. You don't get much more political than that. This is a character that begs to have a political storyline crafted around him. Not fighting the Collector, not fighting characters that didn't really fit the book. I mean, there's a reason why the Red Skull keeps popping up, because from a political standpoint, you've got a Nazi, and this is Steve's eternal enemy. So it made sense that Steve was bringing that into the book, but really updating it. And okay, we're not going to just have an endless parade of Red Skull stories, but let's take on something that's actually going on today and work that into the book to make it relevant. Because again, with Steve Rogers in Captain America, he was a product of the 40s, and he just wasn't connecting with that audience. So it was a brilliant move on Englehart's part to bring in something that people who were maybe more politically minded or active would look at the book and go, man, look what this guy's putting into Captain America. And it's a way to create interest in it.
Yeah, I agree completely. I feel like Captain America as a series and as a character flounders when he is not addressing political issues of the time. If he's just a regular costumed guy fighting random costume villains, he becomes kind of goofy and loses his power. I think he's always better when he is put into political situations. Now, they can be metaphorical, like Mark Grunwald, for instance, much later, did a lot of things that weren't explicitly addressing the current political climate at the time, but were sort of dancing around it. And he still got a lot of interesting messages out, but you have to have some sort of political connection, or else there's just no point to Captain America. And I think that's the problem the book had before this, is they didn't want to get political, or didn't know what angle to take on it. And so it was just villain of the month, and that might work for Spider-Man or something, but it doesn't work for Captain America.
Agreed.
So at the end of the storyline, one of the best parts about this story is at the end, the two Captain America fight, and the real one wins, but he does a lot of soul searching, because he's basically realized, and this is driven home pretty heavily in the story, that the other Captain America and Bucky weren't evil. They had the same ideals as our Cap. It's just something in the process went wrong. They didn't have the Vita rays, so they went crazy. But they started from the same place, and what happened to them could just as easily happened to Cap. And it's really interesting on a character level, but also, again, sort of as political commentary. Basically, good intentions aren't enough. To me, that was the message, is that, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So just because people start in a good place doesn't mean they end up in a good place.
Yeah, I mean, you look at it. You look at the Bucky in that story. Here's a guy who he idolizes Cap, and he finds another guy who idolizes Cap, and they start down this path. And it's like, well, if he'd idolized someone else, if he'd gotten some different advice or different direction, where would he have wound up? So it was kind of a story of, the role models that you're following can certainly lead you astray. So you need to be careful in who you're picking as your role model, and being able to discern between good role models and bad ones.
And it actually leads in right into the next arc, because thematically I found the story in issues 157 to 159 to be very similar. This is where Englehart pretty much ties up all the rest of the loose ends from the previous storylines. There's this mysterious crime boss who's blowing things up, and there's a red herring where Cap starts to think that it might actually be the police commissioner. But it turns out that it's Captain America's former partner in the police force, and he is doing this basically not because he's a villain, but he's perpetrating all these crimes and setting these bombs to try and bring awareness to like how underfunded the police force is. And he's trying to use it as a way to, in a weird way, to make the city safer. So I thought that from the moral of the story, the standpoint thematically was very similar in this arc as the previous one, where we had someone that's not really a villain was coming at it. Again, another sort of reflection of Steve. It's Steve's partner from the force. Same ideals, but ended up going down the wrong path and chose the wrong way to try and accomplish his aims.
Yeah, and it's a good counterpoint to, if you go back to even Steve's origin, where here's this scrawny kid who wants nothing more than to serve in the military, and it's that desire and that drive that puts him on the path he is. And so, you see these other characters, I guess it's the cowled commander, is the alter ego of his partner. They think they're doing the right thing, and they have the best intentions at heart, but ultimately it's just how they're going about doing it is completely wrong, and that's what causes the problem. As you said earlier, that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. That's exactly where this guy is at also. And from a standpoint of, I thought it was a little bit too easy, and maybe I'm a little harsher on it because, it's kind of saying, Englehart's kind of saying, well, we've got all these corrupt cops, and the guy who's trying to ferret out the corruption is corrupt, and he's another corrupt cop, and it just, I don't know if he intended to pick a bone with the police or not. Maybe I just read it differently, but it seemed like he wasn't real thrilled with police departments as a whole. But again, I could be completely off base on that.
Well, it did strike me at least as being an unexpected twist for that character. I mean, that character was the upstanding partner throughout the series before Englehart came on, and even in the earlier issues, it was like he was getting a bum rap. He had been suspended because he was being investigated, but he was sort of trying to prove his innocence. Turned out he wasn't innocent, but it seemed like a bit of a heel turn. I mean, it worked dramatically because I wasn't expecting him to be the bad guy, but it kind of didn't work for me on a character level. It seemed a little too convenient a way to tie things up at the expense of a character who, up to that point, had been shown as a good guy.
Yeah, no, I agree with that.
There were a couple other things that happened in this storyline that are important. The first issue in this arc, 157, was actually scripted by Steve Gerber over an Englehart plot. And according to Englehart, it was Gerber who added the ad-man personality to the new villain called the Viper, who is an advertising guy, kind of like, Don Draper, and speaks in all these slogans television slogans. And he's kind of annoying, frankly. But he's going to become important later on. And even that ad man persona that Steve Gerber gave him here becomes a key plot point not too long in the future that is going to end up driving most of Englehart's main storylines. So while I'm not a huge fan of the original Viper, I do find over the course of these next issues that Englehart does a lot more with him than I would first have guessed based on how kind of goofy he is to start.
Yeah, I mean, I think the concept of the character was fine. I just think Gerber went a little bit too far. I mean, it was, all the slogans. It's like you could get it where it was maybe one, maybe two, but it was every sentence. It was everything the guy said, and at that point, you're basically saying you're making him a cartoon at that point, and just doesn't work if you want him to be a serious character, and if you want him to be seen as a serious threat to Steve. Having him just be completely off the wall, spouting out these catchphrases that he's cribbed from all kinds of other ads, that really works against him. But he is redeemed later on, as it were, as a character when kind of Englehart takes him back under, and Gerber doesn't really have that influence anymore on him.
And the other thing that happens in this issue, this storyline, I should say, that's important is Steve gains super strength. He gets injected with some of Viper's poison. It has a chemical reaction with the super soldier serum, and he gains super strength. Now, according to Englehart, this was editorially mandated. They went to him and said, Cap's kind of boring. We want to give him some super strength. I think it was a bad decision, but Englehart ends up making a lot of hay out of it in terms of drama, because it's not long before sparks start to fly between him and Falcon, where Falcon feels kind of second rate now that Cap has superpowers.
Yeah, I agree. It was one of those things where you could see that it was a higher up decision to juice the book, as it were, and it didn't really make sense. I mean, the appeal of Cap is that he is a peak human. He doesn't have superpowers, and really to give him this, I'm not sure if it was done, because they were looking at doing something else with him, or if it was just, hey, here's Cap now with super strength, and maybe we can push him into another direction and have him take on some heavier weights. But it doesn't work for me either.
So after the end of this storyline, we get Englehart's first one and done issue. That's 160, where he introduces Solar. I don't really have much to say about this issue. I think Solar is kind of a stupid villain. I'm just not a fan. Again, Englehart gets some drama out of the new super strength and how Falcon's reacting to it. The most interesting thing to me in this issue is there's kind of Solar's origin is a little bit vague about exactly how he gets his powers. He's off in the desert, and he just starts absorbing sunlight. And in a letter column for 165, someone wrote in to ask what was going on, and they obliquely state that Solar actually got his superpowers by eating peyote. So I guess that's why they didn't show it in the comic, because they couldn't. But Solar apparently just got super high on peyote out in the desert and came back with superpowers.
Yeah, this is an issue that just doesn't work for me. The villain is bad. To your point, he's got powers that they don't even explain where they come from until 5 issues later. The best part of it is that you see the bigger split happening between both Sam and Steve, as well as with Steve and Sharon. She's left S.H.I.E.L.D. She's decided she wants to be with him. But at the end of the issue, she has left him as well, kind of leaving him pretty much alone as Sam goes back to Harlem and to Layla, and Sharon goes off to parts unknown.
And that leads right into the next two-parter, where we get the sudden shock return of Peggy Carter, tying up a loose plot line from way back in Tales of Suspense number 77. Now, this is several months into this, so Englehart very well may have been doing his research at this point. to me, this just struck me, and I'm spitballing here. I have no reason to believe this is true. Just struck me as a Roy Thomas thing. I have no evidence of that. It just felt very much like, oh, there's this loose end from, 90 issues ago. Why don't we go ahead and write a story explaining it?
Yeah, it's got his fingerprints all over it as well, without being able to confirm that. But it's really nothing that needed to be brought back up. He could have just left well enough alone at that point. So I think that's kind of one of the things, and for all the wonderful things that Roy Thomas has done for comics, is insistence on dragging up minute past events and making a bigger deal out of them. And his obsession with continuity, and trust me, I love continuity as much as the next guy. It's really kind of jarring for the book at this point.
Yeah, I mean, but again, Englehart does some interesting things with what he's kind of given here. Peggy Carr's return is going to end up being a major running plot line here, where she doesn't realize, basically emotionally, she doesn't kind of understand that 20 years has passed. So she's still in love with Steve. He doesn't have the heart or the balls to tell her that it's over 20 years ago. And neither he nor Sharon ever get around to telling Peggy that they're involved with each other. And this causes all sorts of melodrama and soul searching on Steve's part, and like hurt feelings for over the next 15 issues, to the point where it kind of started annoying me eventually. And I felt like Steve is like feeling like crap because he's leading her on, and she deserves to hear the truth. And he's totally right. But I really felt like this was Sharon's responsibility, because when he and Sharon got together, he had no idea that Sharon was Peggy's sister, but Sharon knew the whole time, right? So it's like Cap wasn't hiding anything from anybody, but Sharon was sort of secretly running around behind her sister's back without telling anybody, without ever even telling Steve, what happened to the girl that he loved during the war. I felt like this was Sharon's responsibility to step up and make things right, and of course, she didn't.
Yeah, I felt that this was sort of the replacement from the earlier, the Tales of Suspense and some of the earlier Captain America issues where he was always, upset about, Bucky's death is my responsibility, and he'd kind of gotten over that at this point, and so this was sort of the cross that they gave him to bear was, oh, here's the woman that I loved for like 5 minutes back in World War II, and she's back, and I'm in love with her sister. It was so soap opera-esque, and really could have been solved with one conversation. Okay, look, you've aged, I haven't. Your younger sister's hot. I'm going with her. See you later. We wouldn't have had the 15 issues of this melodrama that they left us with.
Yeah, I mean, I might not have phrased it quite like that, but I completely agree. Like, this is the conversation they should have had right up front. I did appreciate the appearance of Dr. Faustus. I'm a big fan of Dr. Faustus. And I also appreciated the fact that at the end of the issue, they're like, well, he's an evil supervillain that's trying to kill everyone, but damned if he isn't like the best psychiatrist in the world, because he actually did solve Peggy's mental issues, which no one else had been able to do. So I kind of liked that.
Yeah, I've always liked Dr. Faustus. He's just another one of those characters where, look, he's a big, fat guy, and he's not physically imposing, so he's going to beat you with his brain. And for myself, I'm not the most athletic guy in the world, so for me, it was always outlets like chess and games where that's how I beat people. Was I could outthink you, but I wasn't going to beat you down. And that's, I think, why I was always drawn to Faustus. Was he just was a brain, and he devised these schemes, and some of them are so over the top, but that's what makes it great about your brainy villains, is they're going to come up with these Rube Goldberg schemes to defeat the hero, and somehow they always get down to the last loop, and then the ball falls off the track.
So moving on to the next issue, 163 is another sort of one-off. This is a really interesting issue for a few reasons. First of all, we get the Serpent Squad appears here. We get Viper back, and we get Cobra and Viper's brother Eel. And I'm not a science guy, but I didn't think an eel was actually a serpent, but it doesn't matter. And they get mixed up with Captain America again, and they lose again. But over the course of this issue, a few different things happen that are kind of important. Firstly, the Viper sets into motion a plan to discredit Captain America by calling some of his evil cronies on Wall Street and starting a negative ad campaign against him. Now, this is going to become kind of the heart of Englehart's entire run in a few issues, but it feels very, very modern, and partially because this concept has since been swiped by all sorts of other comic book writers for different storylines. From the Legend storyline at DC to you name it. This, in Kurt Busiek's Avengers, there was a similar thing where they were being discredited. What did you think about that development? It only takes place over a couple panels here. It's just the seeds of it. But for me, it's a pretty important moment, both in Englehart's run, but also just in sort of the direction of comics in general.
Well, I think it's brilliant. I really liked the thought process here. Here's this guy in the Viper who, he's used to selling things. And he even makes a comment, well, they sold the president through the media, obviously referring to Nixon. And here he's like, well, if we can do it for, the power of good, let's do it in reverse. Let's tear a guy down with it. And he makes some really choice comments in there. He refers to the public as the great unwashed. And that he says, that the majority of the public only knows what they read in the papers and see on TV. It's a very cynical view of the American people, is that, look, they will believe whatever you throw in front of them. They're not going to go and research it. They're not going to go learn any more on their own. If they see it on TV, if they read it in the paper, well, it's got to be true. And we've moved today to, well, if it's on the internet, it's got to be true. So it's really ahead of its time, to be honest with you. It really was.
One thing that was very much of the time is the issue story, which involves a conscientious objector and Vietnam veteran by the name of Dave Cox. The Serpent Squad end up capturing him and torturing him briefly to try and get information about where Captain America is. And he refuses to fight back. And there's a debate among the characters about, the idea of peace versus violence and whether anything can really be accomplished using violence. And it felt very topical for the time period. It's interesting, in a later letter column, Englehart mentioned that he himself was a conscientious objector who served in the army and was given a honorable discharge because he was a conscientious objector. So this obviously was very close to Englehart, and it was a very sort of timely political story.
Yeah, absolutely. I looked at the way that they handled Dave, and again, there's certainly viable reasons for being a conscientious objector, and maybe you are that way. You have come back from war and you're missing an arm, and you don't believe in war anymore, and that's fine. But I thought the fact that he's getting the crap beat out of him and he's just basically sitting there taking it, it's like there's a difference between being a conscientious objector and not, basically defending yourself. And I thought that was a little bit, it didn't ring true to me, I guess, is where I'm trying to go with that, is that you're telling me that this guy now just will roll over and let anything happen to him because he's not going to fight. And I get that, I guess, but it seemed to be a very extreme version of conscientious objector.
Yes, I agree. One final note for 163 and the Serpent Squad. We're going to see them again later. They become important at the end of Englehart's run, but they're also the inspiration for Mark Grunwald's Serpent Society, which is one of my favorite groups of supervillains, and I just love the Serpent Society issues in Grunwald's run. So even though the Serpent Squad isn't nearly as interesting as the Serpent Society is later, I personally was very happy to see them here.
Yeah, they were certainly interesting, and as a forerunner to that later group, which really the pie there was Cobra. I guess both at least Eel was dead at that point, I believe, and Viper was no longer part of that. But then when Grunwald starts creating all these oddball snake-themed villains with their various abilities, it's like, man, that was just almost pure 60s Stan stuff coming out at that point.
Yeah, I loved the different character interplay between the different members of this. Like, there's issues where you'd have 10, 12 pages. It was just Serpent Society people, like, infighting and scheming and talking. And I didn't miss Captain America at all during those sections. I was like, yeah, let's get a whole book about these guys.
Yeah, that wasn't. I mean, the Grunwald issues were good. Certainly, I wouldn't count them as classics in the run, but when you've got compelling villains like that, I mean, it's a watered down version of the Flash's Rogues, but I could read an entire book of just the Rogues, and if Flash showed up, well, that'd be fine. But if not, I'm cool with those other guys, scheming and fighting and plotting amongst themselves.
So then we move on to 164. Now, 164 is sort of a standalone, although right at the end it ties in with the storyline that follows. It's unusual for, right off the bat, all the issues up to this point, we haven't even mentioned this point, but everything up to here has been drawn by penciler Sal Buscema. And I am lukewarm on Sal. I think he's very solid. He's a very good storyteller. I like it when he's inked by other people, which he is here. And basically, by the 80s, he was inking himself on Spectacular Spider-Man for like 10 years. And I cannot look at those issues at all. Like, they just physically make me ill. I can't stand that art style. So for me, Sal is just sort of a neither here nor there artist. He's replaced just for this issue by Alan Weiss, who also co-plotted this issue. And boy, the shift in artistic tone from Buscema to Al Weiss was extremely jarring.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Sal, to your point, he's a solid number 4 starter in the rotation. He's not going to wow you, but he's going to give you good innings, I guess. But this book is just, too much of a shift for my liking.
I did find the story actually to be really cool. So in this issue, what happens is the Falcon gets word from a friend of his that's in prison that something horrible is happening. So Cap and the Falcon go to the prison and discover it's a trap. There's this woman named Nightshade who has turned all of the inmates into werewolves. And she turns Falcon into a werewolf, but Captain America beats him because of his new super strength. And at the end, it turns out that she was actually being funded by Yellow Claw, of all people. And then she and all of her werewolves jump off the wall to commit suicide. I found the characterization of Nightshade to be really interesting, where Cap is basically like, she's wearing the skimpy, supposed to be sexy outfit, and Cap is kind of like, she's just like a goofy, immature girl playing at being a supervillain. And it really, like, there's the scene where they jump off the building with their deaths, and she's kind of like she seems almost crazed in a sort of internet celebrity sort of way, like she seems like and I realize this is 40 years too early for that, but this sort of thing where she's just looking to make the headlines, even if it means dying.
Yeah, well, I think they reveal later on that she is a teenager. She's just a very intelligent, scientifically advanced teenager. So when I think they add that down the road, looking back, it makes more sense. That she is just basically a little kid playing at something, and probably mixed up in, I mean, if you're mixed up with the Yellow Claw, you're definitely going down the path you shouldn't be going down. So, she's just looking for money to fund whatever it is she's doing, and here she's hooked up with, the yellow menace from the 50s.
There's two other things in this issue I wanted to mention. One is that this story is the inspiration for the infamous Mark Gruenwald story Capwolf, where Nightshade returns and turns Captain America into a werewolf. It ran from Captain America 402 to 407 and is widely, I think, considered to be one of the worst Captain America stories ever, but it's so insanely weird that it's got kind of a cult following to it.
Yeah, it's one of those things you read once to say that you've read it, and then you just gotta tuck it back in the long box, shove it back in the corner, and you just try to get as much mental bleach as you can to get rid of it.
Yes. The other thing is, so the art by Alan Weiss is really moody and intricate. It's sort of like almost like a cross between Barry Windsor Smith and Gene Colan. I thought it was really cool, except, and I don't know if this jumped out to you too, I don't know what the F was going on with Nick Fury's costume when S.H.I.E.L.D. shows up at the end, because he's wearing this fur vest with like a bandolier covered with knives, and he looks like he just ate his way out of Sasquatch. And I turned the page and I was just like, he basically looks like Marvel's version of Frankenstein's monster. I just laughed out loud when I saw that design. Did that jump out to you as well?
Oh, I saw that and I'm thinking to myself, okay, there's got to be a rational explanation for this. But then you get to the beginning of the next issue and they've got him back in his normal clothes. It's like, okay, who effed up? Who did not communicate which direction this was supposed to go? Or did Weiss just decide to go off on his own tangent here? And I'm going to do something completely oddball with Fury that, no one's going to question. It's completely bizarre.
Yeah, I've got to think that Weiss was just completely off the reservation there, and Buscema wasn't having any of it. Because I noticed that too. When I started the next issue, I was like, where's that crazy costume? But it's not there. Fury's just wearing a regular S.H.I.E.L.D. outfit at the beginning of the next issue. Speaking of the next issue, so we got the rest of this arc here. It's 165 to 167. It's versus the Yellow Claw. This, for me, with the exception of a story we're going to talk about right at the end, this I think is Englehart's weakest storyline. It really doesn't work for me. I don't find it very interesting. There's a lot of sort of manufactured drama, which in his defense he was picking up from previous writers, where Cap and Nick Fury are butting heads, so they're both like going after the Yellow Claw on their own instead of teaming up. The handling of Yellow Claw is kind of problematic in terms of racial sensitivity, which I found interesting considering how well Englehart had been doing portraying the Falcon in the African American community. But when it comes to the Chinese community, he was a little bit out to lunch here. And I don't know, there's just a lot of stuff that didn't interest me. Mummies bore me, for instance. And I thought the ending in 167 where the niece turns evil because she's got the evil Pharaoh spirit in her, and then whatever. This whole storyline just didn't do anything for me at all.
No, this storyline is almost like Englehart had been given scripts from the time before him, and it's like, well, I can take a few months off and just kind of run these through because it just smacked of somebody else writing it. I mean, we're talking about giant spiders and scorpions and mummies and possessed nieces who've been kept in suspended animation, and it's like it didn't tie into the rest of his run at all. It was like either I found this somewhere else or somebody dared me to write something so completely off tone from everything else I'm doing, and I'm going to give them this. Because the thing was, they didn't do anything with Yellow Claw after he came back. If this had been kind of his reintroduction to the Marvel Universe, and, well, we're going to kind of fit him in and then work him into something else, I could have seen that. But he comes in and you have this weird story, and then at the end he's gone again, and, well, okay, what was the point of this? Outside of the kind of the few subplots where now that Steve's back in New York and he's starting to see these ads about him, which the Viper and his friends are running now.
Yeah, it was interesting. The subplots were definitely more interesting than the main plot, and they felt better written. Like you say, a lot of this doesn't even feel like Englehart is writing it, but there are parts where you can see Englehart, and none of it's the main plot. There's the subplot with the Viper's advertising comes back up, and then there's some really good stuff with personal drama with Steve sort of agonizing over this, and between him and Falcon, and between Falcon and Layla. There's one scene where it's implied very carefully that Falcon and Layla have just finished having sex. I thought that was pretty adult and something Englehart has done consistently throughout his career, is even in code-approved books slipped in some adult stuff. So there's a lot of like good touches in the fringes, but the main story was just completely blah.
Yeah, and he picks up the thread of Peggy trying to get back to Steve, and so she goes to Harlem, which kind of will fuel some storylines going forward now that she's moved out of Virginia in her parents' house, and she's kind of out in the world now.
Yeah. But overall, even with the little touches he was adding in, this is just kind of a waste of space, to be honest. So that brings us to 168. I only want to talk about this briefly because this is the one issue that Englehart was not involved with. It's actually a fill-in by Roy Thomas. And according to Thomas, at one point, much earlier, it had been announced that Roy was going to be writing Captain America full-time, but he never did it. Before he was taken off the book, though, he had already finished one issue, and it's this issue 168. So when they needed a fill-in, I don't know if this is when Englehart was moving across country, but they decided to publish 168, and I know why they did this. It says actually in the issue that they put this issue in here so Englehart could have time to write the new book he's launching, which in the advertisement here is called Son of Fu Manchu. Of course, we know it as Master of Kung Fu. They obviously changed the title. So while Englehart was making up Shang-Chi, Roy put in this issue, and it's a solid issue, mostly important because it introduces the new Baron Zemo. It's called a Phoenix in this issue, and he supposedly dies at the end, but he'd be brought back much later and become a much more important character in the Marvel Universe than the original Baron Zemo ever was.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good issue, but, it doesn't advance any of the story, which you kind of figured it wouldn't. I honestly would have rather seen this issue expanded to maybe another one and cut that Yellow Claw story short by a month, and that would have been a little bit better use of the space. But yeah, there's nothing wrong with it. It's kind of there. Again, solid, but nothing really memorable, at least at the time.
So that brings us to the beginning of Steve Englehart's most famous storyline, which we will get into next episode. Thanks very much for listening to this episode of the Classic Comics Forum podcast. Next episode, the Captain and I will discuss the second half of Steve Englehart's legendary run on Captain America, issues 169 through 186, which include the Secret Empire storyline, as well as the follow-up, Man Without a Country. So join us next time. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and as always, visit us online at classiccomics.org to join in the conversation.